Greetings everyone, Hamish here, and welcome to the first installment of my series on the French Revolution. Once I've done a few of these, I'm going to be uploading an independent introductory video, which means that today we can move right on to the subject matter of France under the old regime. That is, France in the pre-revolutionary period. In case you're unaware, we're talking about the years prior to 1789, which is when the revolution really expressly begins, and I'd like to introduce the social conditions of this time. To do so, I'm going to employ a very useful shape when it comes to describing societies, and that is the triangle, or the pyramid if you want to be three-dimensional about it. It seems that almost every society in our history has organized itself along these lines, with a very clearly defined apex, and then a broad base where most of the population languishes. At the top in this case, we have Louis XVI, King of France, but not just king, divine, right, absolute monarch. Louis was said to have been appointed by God to rule over the French people with unlimited authority. Honestly, I'm not really sure how present that idea was in the minds of his people, especially as the revolution gets going. We see that his power deteriorates until it's really only tokenistic, but there can be no doubt that up till 1789, he was quite broadly adored by his people. He was a pretty lovable king. In fact, he was just straddling that line between benign king and benevolent monarch. He didn't really inherit much of Louis XIV's political stature. Louis XIV was one of the greatest kings in history, also one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. This Louis, unfortunately for him, had a lack of self-confidence, this inner indecisiveness. Moreover, he actually looked physically clumsy. He was said to have waddled instead of walked, and he was also quite podgy in appearance. So in a way, he was destined to never be a great leader. But from the time he acceded the throne in 1774, he was certainly respected by his people. Just be certain that he was no tyrant. He did have powers of arbitrary imprisonment, and he could exile his subjects at will, but he did not misuse them in a way that a tyrant would. Next we have Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette. Now she was actually widely detested by her people, unlike her husband, and there were a few reasons for this, but the greatest was likely that she was an Austrian. Now, France and Austria had historic bad blood. Until the Treaty of 1756, it was a Treaty of Versailles, it seems that there have been many treaties of Versailles, France and Austria had been sworn enemies, and the public hadn't really recovered. They still had a hostile sentiment towards Austria. So throughout her reign, there were many public cries that she was plotting with the Austrians to overthrow whoever was in power at any point, and she wasn't very popular. She was also known for being quite extravagant, quite frivolous, and really out of touch with the French people. She didn't say let them eat cake. I actually heard that that was her mother, Maria Theresa. Not entirely sure about that. But yes, she was still not at all engaged with her people. And they both lived at Versailles, and that's one of the main reasons they weren't engaged with their people. Versailles was a palace erected by Louis XIV. It was part of his grand plan to concentrate power, and this palace, a little bit out of Paris, it's within walking distance, and we'll see that when a whole bunch of women march to the palace from Paris in 1789. Looking forward to talking about that in a few episodes. And it was with this palace that came all the courtiers, all the nobles, and all the magnificent luxury of the upper classes. Now we'll move on from the king and queen, who were presiding over the triangle, to the triangle itself. And that apex there is occupied by the first estate. Now, estate is just a term meaning class, really, except these were official classes in French society. Now, the first estate was composed of everyone involved with the church. The French church was the Gallican church. It was slightly independent from Rome, and included in this estate was the most eminent archbishop, all the way down to the most humble parish priest. And so, as you may guess, there was quite a big gap in wealth and influence to be found here. And that's why there is another division. I'm not sure if it was an official division, but I know most historians use it. There's a divide between upper clergy, obviously with the powerful archbishops, etc., and then lower clergy, which is where you have the cures, the abbes, which just means the priests who work with the people. And those priests who work with the people could be just as poor as the peasants, which are at the bottom of this triangle, and we'll get to them. And the top archbishops could be the most wealthy people in the kingdom. Next we have the second estate, and the second estate is composed of the nobility. Now again, there is a division here, another official division. The nobility is split between the noblesse d'épée and the noblesse des robes. Now first we have the noblesse d'épée, and that translates to the nobles of the sword. And as you might guess from their title, they were nobles whose lineage extended back to medieval times. And those original nobles would have been responsible for keeping the kingdom safe, for maintaining an army and waging wars, conquest, all that kind of thing. So in a way, these titles were earned. It just happened to be that they were earned generations ago. Now, noblesse d'épée were not necessarily wealthy. Some of the wealthiest people in the kingdom were noblesse d'épée, but they could also be impoverished country nobles. So it really was dependent on the family's status, and that could vary quite a bit. Moving down, we have the noblesse des robes, or the nobles of the robe. Now, these were a relatively new phenomenon. These were nobles who had actually acquired their nobility through purchasing it. It was a process called venality. So the crown opened up all these positions as a way of raising revenue, and then people from the third estate who had enough money, and we'll get to that in a second, were able to actually ascend into the nobility. And the historian William Doyle said something about this. I believe it was, not every noble was wealthy, but every wealthy person soon ended up noble. So there was kind of an expectation that if you were wealthy, you would work your way up to the noble club. And understandably, there was a little bit of contention between the noblesse des robes and the noblesse d'épée. As we'll get to later in this video, there were all manner of privileges associated with being noble, and the noblesse d'épée didn't really like the idea that these new money bourgeoisie people could just make their way into their exclusive class. And nobility was in many ways honorific, but it also did confer all kinds of benefits. And finally we get to the third estate, which was composed of everyone else in the kingdom. So if you're not a noble, if you're not the king or queen, and if you're not in the clergy, you are a member of the third estate. Now, there weren't any official class designations here, but there was quite an obvious financial hierarchy. At the top you had the bourgeoisie, which is the middle class, so you could be a merchant, you could be a doctor or a lawyer, and a whole lot of the nation's wealth and influence was concentrated there, but very little political power, and that's going to be a very big point as we get later into the revolution. And then further down you have the craftspeople, the urban workers, guildsmen, all that kind of thing, and then finally at the bottom you have the peasants. Now, France had a population of 27 million at this time, and it's astonishing to say that 22 million of that 27 was in the peasantry. So this is by far the biggest class in the nation. So you can see that the third estate overwhelmingly constitutes the nation. Now I'm going to talk about how this class system related to privilege. And this is quite complex and interwoven, so I'm only giving a brief account here. The first estate had the privilege of collecting the tithe. And the tithe was a tax. You may have heard of it, it's quite famous, it's from feudal times. And this tax was meant to maintain the church. The church supposedly had the responsibility of providing healthcare, education, keeping the register of births, deaths and marriages. Whether they actually performed much of that is kind of questionable, and it can't be doubted that there were a whole lot of abuses occurring within the Gallican church at this time. France was also devoutly Catholic as well. And a lot of the tithe was just swallowed up by the most wealthy of the clergy, and there was a whole lot of misuse occurring here. But also, the tithe exclusively fell upon the third estate, and it really did hit the peasants quite hard. It amounted to about 5 to 10% of their harvest. And it should also be noted that the first estate owned about 10% of France's land, which they didn't have to pay tax on. So this is a very powerful order, and an order that has a whole lot of privilege and really not a lot of duty to the nation. Moving on to the second estate. The nobility were exempt from all tax except the vingtième, which was a special kind of tax. It was levied in times of war, and it amounted to a 20th of their annual income. Now, prior to the revolution, this tax had been imposed quite a few times for a number of reasons. Paying for the American War of Independence was the main one. And so that was really a rarity. For the most part, though, the nobility didn't have to contribute any tax at all. However, they could enforce a lot of their own taxes on the third estate. Now, the peasants of the third estate weren't owned as such, they weren't serfs, but they did have to pay for the noble's land. And land was apparently quite cheap, but the noble made the peasant pay for all manner of things, whether it was using the wine press of the noble. The noble had exclusive hunting rights, so peasants couldn't kill any pigeons or doves, even if those pigeons and doves were like, ripping up all the seeds they'd just sown. And so being a peasant was really expensive because the nobles did exact quite a lot of revenue out of the peasantry. Then moving down to the third estate, we have a whole heap of taxes, really. There is the gabelle, which is the salt tax, and salt was, of course, really quite necessary as a preserver in these times. There was the corvée, which was 14 days unpaid labour on maintaining roads, which was obviously very unpopular, drew peasants away from their fields in times when quite possibly they were really needed there. There was also the octroi, which was, I believe, a tax on goods. There was the tithe, of course. There was the tile, which was the land tax, and this didn't fall on the other two estates, which is kind of strange because they did own almost all the land in the nation. And so being a member of the third estate was very difficult due to the amount of taxes that were imposed upon you, and the fact that you really had no way to avoid them. Finally, I'd like to touch on how these taxes were collected. The feudal taxes, which were imposed by the nobles onto their peasants, were generally collected by the nobles themselves, but other taxes actually fell under the dominion of the farmers general. Now this was a syndicate that had actually bidded for the right to collect tax. This was a really awful policy, totally inefficient and open to all kinds of abuse. The crown would actually auction the right to collect tax, and then the highest bidder would be able to collect all the tax they wanted, and it was not at all regulated by the crown. So for one thing, the crown was earning much less money than it could have, and also a lot of revenue was just being almost purloined by whoever had paid the most. And a big theme of the pre-revolutionary period is just an inefficiency in the administration. Whether it be collecting taxes, transporting goods, electing officials, whatever it is, under the old regime, generally it's just not a smooth process. So as you may have noticed, this society is very much structured on the feudal system. It's that classic division between those who prayed, the first estate, those who fought, the second estate, and then those who worked, which is everyone else. And the fact that this system is really quite obsolete by the end of the 18th century is going to be one of the main causes, if not the main cause, of the French Revolution. Thank you for watching. Honestly, I'm quite unsure of what I want to do with this series as of yet. Please let me know in the comments whether you like this kind of format, whether you like the idea of me doing something on the French Revolution. Leave the video a like if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.